Greetings Sega fans, it's Dan the Mega Driver here, one half of the Sega guys, and today I'm going to talk about a game that I think is the best 2D platformer in 1995.
The 2D platformer, the centrepiece genre for the 8 and 16-bit eras. Long before Halo and Call of Duty made first-person shooters on the scale of Hollywood blockbusters, or Gears of War and Uncharted ushered in a wave of third-person cinematic cover shooters, the platformer was the jewel, the showpiece in the console's library. From Mario to Sonic, from Bonk to Zool, every platform had its own mascot-driven 2D escapade. But the tide started to change in 1995. The masses wanted 3D. Titles like Bug teased us, until in 1996, Super Mario 64 literally changed the game. So 1995 was a swan song of sorts for the genre, but when you think of the best in the genre that year, there's no shortage of contenders. Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest, which I always mispronounce Diddy Kong's Quest, is one, while SNES owners were spoilt for choice with Yoshi's Island as well. On Sega platforms, Clockwork Knight and its sequel took the limelight, while Knuckles Chaotix rode the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog to become the 32X's most successful title.
But my favourite platformer from 1995 is none of those. It's a game that got a fairly tepid response back when it was released, but it's since grown into a cult classic. It's a game that, when a friend brought it over to my house to play, I fell in love with it instantly. And that game is Ristar.
Well, I say Ristar, others say it's Ristar, like Rising Star. Even Ristar was offered by one Dean Mortlock of Sega Power. It's a debate that seems as likely to be resolved as the pronunciation of Hydrocity. Anyway, Ristar is an absolute gem of a game, and the more I play it, the more everything just hits perfectly, and I've been playing it for the best part of 3 decades now. I first played Ristar when a school friend brought it over to my house. He'd only had it a couple of days and he wanted to show it to me, and at the time I wasn't overly excited with the idea. The response from the media was lukewarm at best, as the industry began to tire of sprite-based platforms. However, on boot, my interest was piqued immediately by the gorgeous intro, which set the tone for the game in a way that you never saw on a cartridge-based console. The story goes as follows: a space pirate called Greedy is conquering the galaxy, and the call is eventually answered by our hero, Ristar. The nature of his origin and how he answers the call differs between regions, but the framing is all that's needed. It's Saturday morning cartoon fodder, and all the better for it. More interesting are Ristar's origins. If you think he bears more than a passing resemblance to a character from the Sonic the Hedgehog universe, that's because he almost was the main man himself. When Sega were putting together concepts for the game that they hoped would topple Super Mario, one such design was a rabbit who would grab platforms and objects with his ears. While a certain hedgehog would go on to take the world by storm in the name of Sega, the design of the rabbit with the extendable ears would live on. Sega CS, using the code base from their earlier work, while also utilising the Sonic the Hedgehog engine, Ristar evolved from a rabbit named Phil to a strange rabbit star mutant thing, to Dex Star, to Ristar, the shooting star as he's known in Japan. All well and good, you may say, but what makes it better than every other platform in 1995? Well, quite simply, the answer is pretty much everything. But let's break it down. Graphically, I feel Ristar is a 16-bit showpiece. While at the time many may have felt it was too conventional, lacking the pizzazz of the digitised Donkey Kong Country graphics, a style which some may say has aged like milk, or the gorgeous storybook art of Yoshi's Island, it feels like peak pixel art for the generation. Colours are bold and bright, giving the game a gorgeous high contrast look. Given so many 16-bit games at this time were going for high detail yet very washed out looks, Ristar stands up as perhaps the embodiment of the art style we'd fallen in love with between 1991 and 1993, but perfected. It's not just the colours, it's the details. Backgrounds are chock full of layers of parallax, so many you'd be forgiven for thinking that the Mega Drive could do an infinite number of them. They also belie their own animations, like the guy on stage 1-2 who chucks explosives at you, or the mad professor cackling away in the background in a boss fight. And speaking of animations, everything from Ristar himself to the enemies, the bosses and other NPCs is impeccably animated. It cannot be stressed enough how much this brings the cast alive, from gigantic hammerhead shark bosses to tiny little angry mole creatures to the birds that you free in World 4. Did it break new ground? Certainly not, but it pushed the Sonic engine to its limits and created perhaps the standout example of that generation's art style. And then there's the music. My goodness. I'll often just stick the soundtrack on to listen to or request a few tracks via Radio Sega. It's just that good. Favourites of mine include Dancing Leaves, which is the Flora Stage 2 theme, has a real party Mardi Gras feel about it. There's Ring Rink, that's the first stage of Planet Freon. It's got a really cool feel to it, it sounds beautiful, especially in the winter. Crying World, that's the first stage for Planet Automaton. This one has a really cool hip-hop industrial feel to it. And then there's the ending theme. You've probably heard a few of these pieces throughout the duration of this video. They're all wonderful pieces of 16-bit music, but paired with the lush visuals and animation, they really come alive. And speaking of coming alive, there are times when the game sounds really react to what is happening on screen. The biggest example being Planet Sonata, but I'll come back to that later. The sounds are also great, making excellent use of the Mega Drive sound chip. Some of the libraries borrowed from earlier Sonic games, but given they already had excellent sound design, that's no bad thing. Like the graphics and animation, the sounds and music help pull Ristar all into one lovely, cohesive whole. The final ingredient is the gameplay, and this is where Ristar really shines. Pun sort of intended. Ristar is a platformer, both conventional and unconventional, and by that I mean the usual tropes of jump in and item collection are there, but it's what Ristar adds that sets it apart. Of course, our hero's stretchy arms are clearly the highlight. The first thing worth mentioning is the combat. It may seem simple, and well, it is simple, but it's so satisfying. Combat mostly revolves around Ristar grabbing an enemy and slamming himself into them, while occasionally tossing items at them. Unlike other games I've mentioned, the collision detection is absolutely pixel perfect. There are no times when you feel like you've missed a grab and it's the game's fault. No occasions where the hitbox feels anything less than perfect. And when you hit that enemy, you get a brilliant hard but springy sound as you send them careering all around the screen. In other platformers released this year, the collision detection feels spongy and imprecise, and Ristar's pitch-perfect mechanics feel immensely satisfying by comparison. Additionally, the grab works in 8 ways, the only restriction being you can't grab down when you're standing. But when swimming or airborne, you can stretch those arms in any direction, and the effect is immediate, making a sense of weight and control even more palpable. Again, this isn't tossing a chain-linked friend or a barrel in one direction, and you don't have to wait for an on-screen cursor to point your egg in the right direction. This is instant and it's dynamic. Of course, attacking enemies is only part of the fun. Ristar can interact with so many objects, pulleys, monkey bars, poles, swings, bombs, and even the platforms themselves, grappling walls so we can gain altitude. Now, none of this may sound particularly special. Great control and responsiveness? We've had that. Excellent visuals? The other games mentioned here are technically better, and at least at the time were considered superior. Even if you could argue that Ristar has held up better than some of those, which I think it does. Best in class sound? Again, both Donkey Kong Country 2 and Chaotix more than give Ristar a run for its money. So what is it? As I've mentioned before, it's the whole cohesiveness of Ristar that makes it more than the sum of its parts. It's the game design and how every single thing I've mentioned so far complements the other. I've already said this much when it comes to the music and graphics, but it extends to the gameplay and the structure too, in absolutely beautiful ways. See, Ristar has more story than the opening sequence gives you. The narrative is weaved into the stage design, very subtly at first. The first 3 worlds fit a specific pattern. Ristar makes his way through the stage, battling Greedy's corrupted creatures, fights a sub-boss, does the next stage, then fights the main boss. But they all have their own little touches. Raiho, for example, is the Planet Flora Elder, but the boss battle with him revolves around defeating the mind-controlling creature attached to his back. This lends to the underlying theme of Greedy's invasion. The blob-like enemies are controlling and corrupting the populations. Of course, when Raiho is freed, he rains confetti on Ristar, who launches into the next world. On Undertow, a deadly hammerhead shark escapes and is corrupted by Greedy's minions, forcing Ristar to drain the area of water to defeat him. A twist of sorts occurs on Planet Scorch. After a tricky battle with a mechanised mole, a cute little critter pops out, seemingly free in a Sonic the Hedgehog kind of way. However, he continues to attack Ristar, meaning the battle isn't quite over. From there, you may recall I mentioned Planet Sonata being a point where the music was particularly poignant, right? It happens to be, in my eyes, one of the greatest examples of all aspects of a game working in harmony. As you start the round, this harsh, repetitive tune is playing. It's very industrial sounding, and while it's a decent track, it's not something you'd expect from the Ristar universe. This changes when you find a small metronome, you carry it to a bird that looks upset about something, pass it to him, and they fly away singing. Suddenly, the music changes. Very subtly at first. You do this several times more. The puzzles to get the metronome to the birds get more convoluted and more complex. The music continues to change. The songbirds remain well animated, expressive, and, even more impressive, no two sprites are the same. It's a wonderful melding of visuals, music, control and problem solving, all weaved into a narrative told entirely through gameplay, and it's absolutely beautiful. Ristar is absolutely full of moments like this, and the more you play, the more you notice them. All of the rounds have their own sub-stories running through them, from the ice creature who menaces Ristar through Act 1, but is eventually brought on to help him in the planet's finale, or the squid-like professor who helms some of Greedy's forces. It's really worth playing through them all to see, and it shouldn't take a seasoned gamer too many attempts to get to the end. That is Ristar's greatest weakness. It's short and fairly easy. It's not without its difficult moments. I certainly died while capturing this footage more times than I would have liked. But it can be conquered without too much trouble, and there's not much to pull you back, aside from, as I said, the pleasure of seeing it all again. Even the bonus sections do little but give you some score bonuses, and that matters little in a game where there's no secret ending or no high score table. Though the passwords that you do get by playing the bonus round unlock some cool little secrets. Of all the games I've mentioned, only Clockwork Knight has less stages, but Ristar is a hell of a ride while it lasts. It is an outstanding experience from start to finish. That hour or more that you spend seeing it through is absolutely magical. Ristar isn't a big game, and it doesn't need to be. It's a perfectly crafted 2D platformer and representative of the absolute pinnacle of the genre. It is greatness distilled into a small experience, not dragged over several copy and paste intermediate stages. Like I said, when I first played Ristar in 1995, after a friend brought it over to my house, I was in love with it instantly. I'd read the middling reviews and expected a bland Sonic clone. What we have instead is a huge, underrated and underappreciated gem of a game. It's a shining star in a hobby, an example of exactly what a short, sweet platforming classic should be. It didn't need a hook to keep me coming back, no extended runtime or collectibles. I went back purely because I loved it. Sometimes it's easy to judge a game based on its individual merits, and you could argue other games being objectively better than Ristar on this basis. But I'd argue Ristar was more than the sum of its parts, and no platformer that year was as much of a satisfying, cohesive video game, and that is why I feel Ristar was the best platformer of 1995. And that brings us to the end of the video. In truth, I've only scratched the surface of Ristar. There's so much more that we can discuss, like the regional differences, the full story behind its development, or even the exceptional Game Gear poll. Would you like more SEGAGuys Ristar related content? What was your favourite platformer of 1995 if it wasn't Ristar? Please get in touch, whether it's in the comments below, or if you want to reach out to us on Twitter, you can catch me at swooper_d, you can catch James at the Segaholic, you can catch us both at SEGAGuys. But until next time, stay retro and stay Sega.